Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. If you've watched this show for a while, you may recall some stories about the dedicated cavalry of Grand Normandy. But those were set in the present day, and the cavalry was well established. How did Grand Normandy get its dedicated cavalry? The answer lies back in the days of World War II. The evacuee. Delivered by hand. Date, March 11th, 1943. 2. Majory Head Office, Stoke Norrie, Oxfordshire. Attention, Major Joseph Crewis. From Lieutenant Claudine Blackholt. Subject, evacuee. Sir, I write to inform you that I am under pressure by my unsundered neighbors to take on an evacuee. Oswick is required to take a number large in proportion to the size of the village. I am, of course, known to be eccentric, but it will draw hostile attention if I refuse. On the other hand, if I accept, we have the attention of the evacuee. Given the importance of our work and my own inexperience in espionage, I do not judge myself competent to decide whether or not to accept an evacuee. Please advise. A log of circumstantial detail is attached. Delivered to courier March 11th, 1943. Date, March 13th, 1943. 2. Majory Field Lab, Oswick, Oxfordshire. Attention, Lieutenant Claudine Blackholt. From Major Joseph Crewis. Subject, evacuee. Lieutenant, accept the evacuee. I grew up in a small unsundered village, so I fully appreciate your misgivings about being more conspicuous. It is true the evacuee will be observing you at close hand, but there will be only one, a child, a transient, and almost certainly not an enemy agent. The luck of the sundering may even mean they are unobservant. You must simply play shell games to prevent them seeing anything. To increase security for your work, Brother Eugene will now be accompanied by Lieutenant James Fletcher of the Vanguard. Fletcher is to deal with any matters touching on security and espionage, and, when not otherwise engaged, to assist you. Delivered to courier March 13th, 1943. The buses were supposed to arrive in the late morning, but no one was surprised that they only rolled onto Oswick Green late in a blowy, wet afternoon. All the organizers and hosts and hostesses had been drifting about the green before the church all day, coming and going and waiting. When the buses came in sight, Mrs. Davies, the vicar's wife, hustled everyone into the church hall, and the moment she thought she might possibly get a hearing, shouted, over the muttering, "Listen, everyone, please. I know how exasperated we all are, but do remember that the people on those buses are not at fault. Let us swallow our impatience, we've had to do that often enough these last few years, and start on a good footing." The muttering ebbed somewhat, though of course Mr. Cavalry started to voice a rebuttal. Someone told him to stow it. Mrs. Davies ignored him and headed back outside. The other three organizers trailed after her. The buses had parked and were disgorging the evacuee mothers, their children, and the unaccompanied children. Mrs. Davies hoisted her clipboard and waded in. Soon everyone was in the church hall, evacuees along one side, hosts along the other, each with their own tea table, the organizers bustling back and forth between the groups, matchmaking. Of course, the unaccompanied children were the worst, the saddest. Some just looked stunned. More looked woebegone. A few looked about eagerly, keen for adventure. Others had faces shut up tight and eyes that looked about warily. Well past the midway point, Mrs. Davies zeroed in on one of the wary ones, a thin girl of about 12 with short dark hair. She clutched a small suitcase in one hand and a book and notebook in the other. There was an academic note to the wariness of her gaze. She was studying the situation to see what might be interesting. "And you are?" Mrs. Davies asked her. "Ivy, ma'am." She put down her suitcase and produced a card from inside her coat. A pack of cards, in fact. She peeled off one and handed it to Mrs. Davies. It was hand-lettered and read, "Ivy Treadwell, contact Mrs. Ann Treadwell," followed by a street address. "How very practical," approved Mrs. Davies. "May I keep this?" Ivy nodded. "That's why I've got 9 now." Mrs. Davies tucked the card into her clipboard and looked over the list of hosts. Which of the remaining should take Ivy? She looked the girl over. Tired and stressed, who wasn't? Alone, but holding it together. The book in her hand was titled Natural History for the Beginner. "Plan to do some bird watching?" she asked, "or hiking?" Ivy followed her gaze. "Mum gave me the book for going away. She thought it would give me something to do if—" She trailed off, but Mrs. Davies nodded. "If you found yourself at loose ends, keep your mind engaged," she summed up. "Very good. Let's see." She checked the list again. Reserved, with an active mind. Would the similarity help them get along or cause friction? Mrs. Davies made a guess and said, "Right, come with me, Ivy," and led her into the group of prospective hosts. "Miss Blackholt, this is Ivy." She consulted the card. "Treadwell. Ivy, this is Miss Claudine Blackholt. I think the two of you might get along well." She gave them 3 seconds to voice objections, but no one did. She smiled, said, "Excuse me," and moved on to the next case. The two stared, taking each other in. Ivy saw a tall, slim grown-up, not an old one, with face pale and long and a little bony, hair dark and long and done up in a braid coiled around her head like a crown. She wore a long navy blue dress. Against the cold, she wore a plaid woolen shawl and, patriotically, 3 scarves in red, white, and blue. "Ivy," said Miss Blackholt, noting the name. "Let's go to my house and have tea. Are you hungry?" "Yes, miss," said Ivy as they set out. Soon they were crossing the green. Oswick was quite small. In short order, they were near the edge of town, walking down a gentle slope toward a forest. A cottage was banked up against it, with slate roof, whitewashed walls, and a curl of smoke from the chimney that suggested tea could be quite soon. As they got closer, Ivy studied the gardens. They seemed very extensive for such a small place, though Ivy could not be sure, being a city child. They were certainly bigger than any of the Dig for Victory allotments in her neighborhood. They stretched out on both sides, especially to the left, where they included 3 long glass greenhouses. Nothing bloomed now at the end of winter, and little was even green, but it all looked neat, already free of weeds and tree leaves, ready to spring into action. On the right side stood a smaller plot of garden, a garage, and 4 tall white boxes. "You have a farm?" Ivy asked. Miss Blackholt smiled. "Just a big garden, though I suppose it's hard to mark the difference between a very big garden and a very small farm. I grow rare medicinal herbs and sell them to pharmacies, doctors, and hospitals." Ivy nodded. Sounded useful, maybe even interesting. She focused on the 4 tall white boxes. "Are those beehives?" "Yes. Not much doing now, of course. The bees are dozing, hibernating. But of course they go with a garden. Good for each other. Here we are." She opened the door and led Ivy in. It was warm and dark. They stood in a small living room full of bookcases and armchairs. Miss Blackholt went to a fireplace, threw a couple of logs on a bed of embers, and brought up the fire. Then she began lighting candles and oil lamps. The room got slightly brighter. "Not much in the way of modern conveniences, I'm afraid," said Miss Blackholt, though her tone was not apologetic. "No electricity. I have a small wireless, but it runs on a battery. Water is from the pump in the kitchen and the one out back, but it's good. No phone. I use the one at the pub. But it is warm and comfortable here. We'll have tea in the kitchen." The kitchen was at least as big as the living room, but more crowded and dominated by the stove. "Is that an Aga?" asked Ivy, much impressed. "Mum's friend Mrs. Maplewhite has one, but it's not half the size of this one." Miss Blackholt smiled proudly. "Yes, it is. Very useful. You see, I don't just send the leaves and roots out to the pharmacies and doctors. That too, but also infusions and decoctions and essential oils and so on. I use the aga to make those, along with heating and cooking, of course. The top of the aga was crowded with pots and kettles and small glass vessels, many quite small. A rich, heady odor surrounded it. It didn't smell like food, more like a garden. Some years later, when Ivy smelled a new-mown meadow after a summer rain, the odor came back to her. She was glad when Miss Blackholt sat the pair of them down at a small table close to the oven. "You don't have it going very hot," she observed. "No, most of my work uses a gentle heat. And of course you don't want to leave a raging fire behind when you go out of the house. But this should still be hot enough." She lifted a kettle off the stove, poured into a teapot, and picked up a tea infuser. "Black tea?" Ivy nodded. "Another time we can try other kinds." She filled the pot, then produced a heaping plate of biscuits, cookies, to the American soldiers Ivy had overheard in the shops back home, from under a cover on the aga. They were dark brown, dotted with black. "Help yourself," she told Ivy, "and don't worry about sugar and flour rations. These are made with acorn flour from the woods behind the house and sweetened with honey from the hives. The black bits are dried berries, not raisins. So you see, entirely local biscuits." "Thank you, miss," said Ivy, reflecting that this was the pleasantest development of the day. "Do not," warned Miss Blackholt as she reached for the first biscuit, "expect chocolate just because they're dark brown. In fact, try not to expect anything in particular." Ivy proceeded carefully. The texture was a mix of powdery and chewy, and there was a coffee-like slant to the taste, but also fruity. "It's good," she said, though the advice about having no expectations had been useful. "Thank you," she repeated. "Honey for the tea as well," said Miss Blackholt when she poured. "I'm afraid I bartered my sugar ration for milk, cow's milk." She put 2 milk pitchers on the table, one with a white string tied in a bow around the handle. "This one." She indicated the pitcher with the bow. "The other one is sheep's milk, if you care to try it." Ivy guessed that sheep's milk was available locally and not rationed. She tried a little in her tea. It replaced the harsh note of the black tea with a strange, buttery, sour one, but it went well with the acorn biscuits. She had her second cup black, as she had learned to take it back home, but put in plenty of honey, since that seemed to be in good supply. Many biscuits later, Miss Blackholt showed Ivy her room. It was upstairs, with a window that overlooked the front of the house. The room was whitewashed and looked bare but very clean. Besides the bed, there was one chair, a bedside table with a candle and a ewer and basin set, which intrigued Ivy, and a wardrobe. Each wall had at least one shelf packed with books. "This may be your room during your stay," Miss Blackholt told her. Ivy felt a little flicker of relief at the indirect reminder that she would eventually go home. "But I must tell you of a complication. I am expecting another guest, a patient, in fact. He is a soldier who has suffered a strange attack. They want me to see what I can do. I do not yet know which room will suit him best. He may even want to stay in the garage by himself. But at the moment I have the next room back set up for him. It is over the kitchen and warm. I'm sorry this room is not as warm, but I will see you are well supplied with blankets." "I'm sure it will be fine, miss, thank you," said Ivy. She put down her suitcase and began exploring. The room was certainly cooler than the kitchen, but at the moment that was refreshing. The wardrobe was empty and would not look much fuller after Ivy unpacked into it. The ewer was full. There was a cake of soap and folded washcloth and towel next to the basin. The book titles were mystifying. Apiculture Avancée, The Segregation of the Queen, Smoking of Wild and Domestic Hives, Due Devinti Calende Revelationis, Mrs. Greaves a Modern Herbal, Psychomedicinal Sachets, 12 Meditations on the Honeycomb, Florigelium Santa Alicia. Down in the kitchen, a kettle whistled. "I must attend to that," Miss Blackholt said. "In the meantime, have a look around." She headed out the door, then paused, turned, and added, "If you choose to go outside and into the woods, keep an eye out for the church steeple. That way you will not get lost." The whistling continued. She left. Ivy stood in the middle of the room and reflected on how alone she was. Mum was miles away. Dad was further away in Algeria, and she could only hope the one not being bombed and the other not shot at. Well, she recalled Mum's parting words at the bus pickup. "Don't worry about me, won't help. Anyway, I'll be fine." As if she could know. "Write to me, tell me all about where you're staying, that way we'll be in touch." Dad had said write to me too, and she and Mum both dutifully did. There had been 4 letters in reply, though the last was some weeks back. So Mum wanted to know about this place. Ivy did too, and she'd been told she could look around. The next room, the one for the soldier, looked very like her own, except for the placement of the window. It was warmer, and the chimney ran up one corner. She hoped this soldier liked books like De Natura Elementorum, Form and Quality, or Cinq Exemples Distillatione, or had brought his own reading. There were 2 other rooms upstairs. One was a 3rd bedroom, not so bare, with books and papers scattered all over it, presumably Miss Blackholt's. Ivy did not think the pass to look around extended to this room. The 4th room seemed to be storage, with a lot of furniture, boxes, and bottles. And more books, of course. She went downstairs. Miss Blackholt was busy at the Aga. "I'm going to look around the garden," Ivy called to her. Miss Blackholt, without turning around, gave her a nod and a wave. The garden seemed even bigger when you were inside it, picking your way along the paths. Young plants were starting to peep up in the greenhouses. They were all neatly labeled, but this didn't do Ivy much good, as the names were all in Latin. Behind the house was more garden, bordered by a picket fence. Beyond the fence stood the woods, and in the fence was a little gate. Into the woods? She looked over the gate and saw a narrow footpath winding away into the trees. From what Miss Blackholt had said, she was allowed to go in there. She had even been given that handy tip. Ivy turned around and looked up the gentle slope to the town center and the church steeple. Ivy decided she would not venture into the woods, certainly not today. The gardens on the other side of the house were smaller, a bit crowded between the beehives and the garage. She approached the beehives cautiously, but there were no bees visible. However, when she crept up to the hives, she heard a soft rumbling hum. She passed on at a respectful distance. The car stood outside the garage, where Miss Blackholt had said the soldier might want to stay. Curiosity piqued and legitimated beforehand, she entered. As far as practical, it looked like the room above the kitchen, or her own. There was not much furniture, a small table with a lamp and a basin and ewer, a small square mirror on the wall, a little bookcase, and a bed. Only the walls were bare board, and the floor was packed earth, as you would expect in a garage. And the bed was a great piece of canvas. On inspection, it was a piece of canvas on top of 2 mattresses side by side. Ivy felt sure it was a bed only because there was a pillow at one edge and a stack of blankets at the other. So the soldier might want a regular bed, or he might want a very big bed? Because... She gave it up and looked at the bookcase. For a wonder, the titles were intelligible. Ivanhoe, Soldiers 3, Plain Tales from the Hills, Barracks Room Ballads, Bible. Oh, but here we go again. Legenda Aurea, Breviarum Romanum, De Re Equestri. Was she expecting a very educated soldier? There were some other houses along the road up the hill. She walked past them but saw no one. It was getting drizzly. She returned to the house. Miss Blackholt had finished answering the demands of the whistling kettle. This had resulted in some dishwashing. She asked Ivy to help and showed her how to use the pump at the sink. The dishes, though, were all glassware, and Ivy only washed. Miss Blackholt rinsed them very carefully before letting Ivy handle them, then dried them herself very carefully with a white towel that looked too nice to call it, with a white cloth that looked too nice to call a towel. Ivy decided to see if Miss Blackholt had meant it when she had said Ivy could have a look around. "Why would the soldier want such a big bed?" she asked over the dishes. Miss Blackholt gave Ivy one sidelong glance, then stared out the window over the sink. She had opened the window before having Ivy come near the sink. "Ah, well, he may be subject to fits and need room to thrash around. It'll all depend." Ivy did not feel she was being lied to, but she did feel a great deal was being left out. Well, people like to be private about medical problems. Ivy still had no idea what was the matter with Mrs. Morris across the street. "Is his problem embarrassing?" she asked. "I mean, should I not ask him about it?" "Yes, that would be a good idea." Miss Blackholt looked so relieved, Ivy could only conclude that it must be a very embarrassing problem. She glanced at a covered pot, muttered, "The longer the better," then said to Ivy, "Let me show you around the village. Then this will be done, it will be time for an early supper, and we'll have worked up some appetite." "It's raining, miss," Ivy noted, looking out the window over the sink. Miss Blackholt followed the glance, but said, "Not badly," and led Ivy to the door. There she handed her an umbrella and her coat, threw on the plaid shawl, and selected a different set of scarves from the hat stand, green and yellow. Then she took an umbrella for herself and stepped out. They made their way up the gentle slope. Miss Blackholt gave the names of the people in the houses, and Ivy promptly forgot them. They made a circuit to the edge of the village, Miss Blackholt pointing out the ways to the nearest towns. Ivy didn't recognize the names. Working their way into the village, they passed the school. 2 rooms, Miss Blackholt told her. "I gather you will be going to school here, but just 2 days a week. We have so many students now, they must attend in turns." A short way on, they came to the green and the town center. The church, a grocer, a blacksmith, a post office, a dry goods shop, and a pub. "The peas blossom," said Miss Blackholt, pointing at the signboard bordered with a flowering pea vine. "Now for that supper." They furled umbrellas and entered. It was, of course, crowded and noisy, but it was also warm and smelled of food. Several people seemed to have had the idea of taking their evacuees to supper at the pub on the first evening. Ivy recognized some fellow passengers in the crowd. A young man in uniform stared at them from the bar, then left his place and worked his way over toward them. He handed an envelope to Miss Blackholt, swept Ivy with a worried gaze, then surprised her very much by saying to Miss Blackholt, "En evacuee, est ça wit, sauve la Marjorie." An evacuee, is this wise? Does the Majorie know? Miss Blackholt looked confused. "I fait ça de Majorie Onald." "I'm doing this on Majorie instructions," she answered, surprising Ivy even more. "Sauve no l'avant-garde?" "Doesn't the vanguard know?" The young man looked confused, then doubtful, and said, "Never mind, I suppose they must." "Here, what's that talk?" In the crowd there were, of course, other people at every elbow. It was just too bad that one of them was Mr. Cavalry, thin, hunched, and perpetually grumpy. "French," Miss Blackholt said promptly. "Didn't sound like it," Mr. Cavalry replied. "You're used to Parisian French," Miss Blackholt returned. "This is Channel Island French. The corporal here is from there." The young man smiled bleakly at Mr. Cavalry. "The Channel Islands are in German hands," Mr. Cavalry said, looking with suspicion, or at least puzzlement, at the young man. "Don't I know it," the corporal said, "but we've got a resistance movement going. Meantime, I'm doing my bit here. Got to be going, though." He flipped a salute to Mr. Cavalry, another to Miss Blackholt, and pushed toward the door. Miss Blackholt glared daggers at his retreating back. Why had the young fool done that? No doubt he reasoned speaking Chenolese would keep the information private, but why talk at all? He was of lower rank and in a different service. He had no call to be questioning her actions. Ignoring Mr. Cassidy's questions about when she had been to the Channel Isles, she pushed through the crowd to the ladies' section, making sure Ivy was trailing her. No hope of a private table, of course. They were lucky to be able to squeeze in with Mrs. Cox. She was generally amiable, but her amiability was being tried by what looked like an argument brewing between her own daughter and the evacuee boy she had taken on. "Melody, if he says his dad's a colonel, you've no cause to contradict him. Johnny, eat up." "Jamie," the boy corrected in a tone indicating this was not the first time. "Is this Rabbit? I don't like Rabbit." Mrs. Cox ignored this and addressed Miss Blackholt. "Quite a boarding house you've got going," she remarked, "with this soldier coming in." "I'll manage," Miss Blackholt answered, smiling. "They still don't know what's wrong with him?" "Not exactly. I've got a list of things to try." "Is he still bringing his horse?" asked Mrs. Cox. "That seems like a terrible imposition on you." "Well, his problem involves his legs, you see. But he's cavalry, so he can use the horse's legs." "Cavalry," said Johnny, readily dropping the spoon of suspected rabbit stew. "I thought modern cavalry was jeeps and motorcycles and like that." "Still some horses," Miss Blackholt assured him. Then to Mrs. Cox, "I've set things up in my garage." Ivy frowned to herself. It had not looked like the garage was set up for a horse, but then she knew nothing about horses. Miss Blackholt now remembered the letter thrust on her by the impudent courier, his actual reason for hanging about, she inferred. She excused herself to Mrs. Cox and read. Then, "He's coming tonight, in fact," she announced. "Has he ridden the horse in fighting?" asked Jamie. "Oh, yes." Well, we'll find out what's up with Miss Blackholt's mystery patient and why she and the corporal speak a language called Chanelese next time.